Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is on knowledge translation, translating knowledge to inform policies.
Have we lost Joyce?
Pardon?
Go ahead, Joyce.
Yes. In partnership with, the webinar is organized by the Aga Khan University's Institute for Human Development in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation, with the ECD Action Network, UNICEF, and the Lego Foundation. And just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. We encourage everybody to introduce themselves using the chat button at the bottom of the screen. When posting, please select all panelists and attendees so that you can introduce yourself to everyone. And let us know your name, which country you're joining us from, and your organization. And if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A tab. It's at the bottom of your screen. And you can send questions at any point during the webinar. We'll be addressing the questions at the end of all the presentations. So it's a pleasure to have you on this webinar, and my pleasure to introduce you to the panelists. For the opening remarks, we will have Florence Kitabire, who is from UNICEF Isaro. And over to you, Florence.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to be here for this webinar this afternoon. I do believe that truly you're all ECD champions, for which we very much appreciate. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar. And as our colleague has mentioned, it's focused on translating knowledge to inform policies and enhance the delivery of effective ECD services and interventions. We want to say thank you to the Aga Khan University Institute of Development, the Aga Khan Foundation, and the ECDAN, or ECD Action Network Global, with all its branches, for organizing this important event in the lead up to the launch of the ECD Workshop Hub happening next week. As UNICEF, we are excited to be partnering with Aga Khan University Institute for Development and the Foundation to launch the ECD Workforce Hub. As many of you may have learned from the webinar itself, information, to be as part of the scale up of Playful Parenting Initiative, which is supported by our partners, the Lego Foundation, for which we are grateful. The goal of this hub is to support the scaling up of parenting support programs, to promote the holistic development of our young children. This is properly aligned with the nurturing care framework. We see that this hub will act as a key to building the capacity of our ECD workforce, who are really our frontline workers in supporting our parents in this. And we need to support to build their capacity to improve access to technical advice. And importantly, how do we translate scientific research into practical and accessible materials for policymakers and practitioners? And as you see, it is our focus, the focus of our discussion today. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that through the scaling up of Playful Parenting Program, which Aga Khan Foundation and University and UNICEF have already initiated work, in several ways to translate knowledge into practice. And some of what is ongoing is through the following. There has been development of key technical resources, such as a series of case studies focused on the adaptation and implementation of the care for child development approach that, of course, we all know commonly around the region as CCD. And this will support countries' efforts to adapt this approach to their own contexts as they build capacity of the frontline workers. The integration of ECD and key development topics into university degrees and professional development programs has also been implemented in some of our countries, especially Kenya and Zambia. In Zambia, for example, as UNICEF, we've been working together with the country office, as country office with partners to integrate ECD and responsive caregiving into the Ministry of Health Nurses Training College curriculum. We know that it's already also in other curriculums, but for this particular one, we want to salute Zambia for even incorporating it in the nursing training college curriculum. There's also a lot of work going on, raising awareness of policymakers in Zambia and Kenya through workshops focused on the science of ECD and the importance of investing in ECD interventions. I just want to recall that as when the 2016 series, Lancet series came out, I happened to be in Zambia at that time, and UNICEF with partners, it was great to see the national launch of this Lancet series, and it went a long way in breaking awareness and also leading to the development of the ZECDAN, the Zambia ECDAN. I hope it's still as active for now. And by the way, Zambia is one of the countries that really demonstrates the government, several ministries working together with partners, both private and NGOs, to promote early childhood development. I believe that they will only improve as the years go by. Therefore, we look forward this afternoon to learning more from the presenters today of our initiatives that are translating knowledge to inform policy and practice within the global ECD space. As these learnings, we know, will help inform the future work of the ECD Workforce Development Hub. I welcome all of you and look forward to very fruitful deliberations this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florence, for that, for those wonderful remarks. For this next part of the webinar, I'm handing over to Professor Amina Abubakar to take us through. Welcome, Prof.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. It's my pleasure to take a few minutes to introduce you to the ECD Workforce Hub that we intend to launch. I will share a few slides to guide the discussions. So let me turn that into slideshows, please. So the ECD Workforce Hub that we intend to launch will be a virtual hub. So we aren't expecting to have a space where people are, and it will be based at Aga Khan University and will be led by the Institute for Human Development. What we hope is that the hub will address the challenges experienced by ECD programs and services in terms of access, knowledge, and evidence. Yeah? So just in terms of access, we hope to contribute to ensuring that communities and stakeholders within the ECD sector are able to obtain and utilize holistic quality ECD services. We are especially keen on the most marginalized communities. For instance, in the first, moving forward for the next 3 years, one of our key target areas in Kenya will be the arid and semi-arid populations of Kenya, where we know that regions of Kenya, where we know so many children do not have access to quality ECD services. We'll also try to bring together knowledge resources that we'll develop and deliver, mainly to help enhance competencies and skills of practitioners, parents, government officials, academics. We'll be very keen for content-specific needs, so we tailor-make these programs to address the specific needs. And we are very keen on all frontline workers. So for instance, it's not just teachers we'll target, we would want to work with nurses, we would want to work with the different multi-sectoral partners in this space. And lastly, the hub will try to translate the evidence from low-income settings on what works in child development into effectively packaged content for communication to the target audience. So most of the time, there's quite a lot of knowledge that may go into peer-reviewed journals that largely maybe academics can access. So what would be the simple, knowledge products that we can produce that everyone can access and use them out in the field? So our key objective is to try to inform policy and practice and ensure we bring changes at individual and system level. We would also try to enhance knowledge and skills of the key ECD stakeholders like policymakers, government officials, educational institutions, and frontline workers. Our key activities can be grouped into three. We will look towards professional development services. This will be short courses that can be offered to target groups. We already have several of these. For instance, we offer the science of early childhood education. We do train people on child for care development, but we would hope that moving forward, we will develop courses that capture other areas that are of interest to the ECD stakeholders. For instance, inclusive early childhood education. So the nurturing care framework, to interpret it and really look at ways we can support children with disability. Would be keen on issues around ECD and gender. How do we introduce gender transformative practices within the ECD sector, both at the classroom level, at the community level, institutional levels? Yeah? We are also keen on giving bespoke and technical advisory services to policymakers. We have a short course, we call it the ECD Policymakers Workshop. It really tries to speak to policymakers on why investing in ECD is critical. And what we are doing moving forward is really not just delivering the workshop, but actually working very closely with the government officials on developing, action plans and how they implement, and being there for them to provide technical support. And lastly, we would want to do knowledge into action products. Yeah? So policy briefs, but also short audio and video, clips that people can put onto the platforms and listen to. But we are keen in terms of knowledge into action to actually have a community of practice. ECD practitioners who can talk to each other about what's happening. This can be through webinars, it can be through small workshops in local regions. And largely for us, what I find most interesting is not to actually be able to document success, but also to document what hasn't worked, so that we don't keep replicating the same things, but we can learn from each other and keep improving our programs. So basically our theory of change is that if we have all this input, I won't go through all that, if we have all the inputs in terms of modules and technical support, mentorships, policy engagement, what the outcome will be is highly skilled ECD workforce, engaged and motivated policymakers, access to a community of learning where people can continuously learn new skills, but also relevant evidence-based policies and practice. We hope that this can really enhance early childhood services in all the regions we work in, and that this can bring out our vision to nurture the potential of every child in everywhere. Now, this hub has been a dream for us for maybe 3 or 4 years. A series of activities have been happening on the background to get us here, and it would not have been possible without the generous support of UNICEF, Lego Foundation, Conrad Hilton Foundation, Johnson & Johnson, and the Aga Khan Foundation. So we would love to acknowledge all our funders. Thank you very much.
So the next presentation is on a mapping study that we did on the capacity building needs in the East and Southern African region, specifically in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia. So just a minute to pull up my presentation. Okay, so as we know that the early years are critical because they constitute the period in which children are most susceptible to any interventions that are introduced to address their needs and to ameliorate the effects of exposure to risk factors such as poverty, malnutrition, and non-responsive caregiving. And evidence shows that ECD workforce, and especially the frontline workers, have a key role to play in terms of addressing providing services that can address the needs of children. So in this study, we looked at how the capacity of the workforce that are involved in providing services for children in their early years, and we conceptualized capacity building as the process for increasing knowledge, skills, motivation, using the framework that looks at individuals, organizations, and systems, and how they could be used to attain the desired change. So this study, the objective was to identify what capacity needs exist among the ECD practitioners, and also to make recommendations on the required support in the study countries, the 4 study countries. So we used the UNDP framework for needs assessment and looked at the 3 levels of capacity development. That's at the individual, at the organizational, and at the systems level. So without going into too much detail, we conducted this study during the COVID-19 period. And so we used an online survey, which we sent out to a number of participants who were purposely selected from the 4 different countries. It had open-ended questions, just exploring what their perceptions of the capacity needs are in the region. And so the gaps that we identified in terms of imparting knowledge and skills and motivation among the ECD workforce. First, at the individual level, there was a lot of mention that there are very few high-quality ECD training programs. So apart from the pre-service trainings and let's say ECD teachers and frontline workers undergo during training, there isn't many other opportunities for accessing trainings. And then even for the trainings that are available, there isn't sufficient focus on the soft skills. We know that the interventions that are delivered through the frontline workers are intense in their need for them to have soft skills such as communication, counseling skills. So all of that, there isn't a sufficient focus on that. And then for the courses that are there, they are high costs. They require sometimes participants to pay fees to access them, and the range that was mentioned was between $300 to $750 in the region. So that for that group of workforce was perceived to be high cost and not easily accessible. There was also the fact that some of the high quality programs that are available are online, and there is the issue of connectivity. And for those that are not online, they are provided in urban areas. So in terms of reach in the rural areas, there's a limitation in that area. And then there is insufficient follow-up, and that includes mentorship, coaching, supportive supervision. So that all those were mentioned as the gaps that practitioners noticed in their practice. And at the organizational level, there was mention of insufficient technical assistance. So people who've gone through the training or are in practice are not able to access technical assistance. So only a small percentage of them said that they're able to access technical assistance whenever they need it. And then there is insufficient resource allocation. So in terms of human resource, there are staffing issues and very high rate of turnover among trained personnel. And then there isn't sufficient infrastructure, and the infrastructure in particular was mentioned in terms of supporting children with special needs as well as workforce with special needs. So this was an area that came out strongly in terms of how the infrastructure in the workplaces can support workforce who have special needs to be able to carry out their tasks. And then there are funding gaps as well, and the funding that's available is seasonal, it's donor funded and unsustainable. And then looking at the systems level, where we looked at policies and frameworks, right now within the countries of focus, there is a drive towards developing policies that are integrated and that are holistic, and that is in particular with the focus on the nurturing care framework. So looking at all the elements of the NCF. So, and then because policies haven't been there in place up to this point, then what follows is that there isn't sufficient budgetary allocation to address the needs. So within the region, there are steps that are starting to be made, but then the gaps are still there. Now, in terms of recommendations, at the individual level, the recommendation is to increase the number of high quality ECD courses and trainings, to enhance access to training opportunities, developing ECD technical resources that are easily accessible to the workforce in this area, and then carrying out post-training support to ensure that you galvanize the learnings that they achieve through the trainings, and also encouraging peer learning and exchange. Here, participants who took part in the study said that they were interested in seeing how networks such as the ones in the region, actually all of the 4 countries have national ECD networks, and a lot of the ECD workforce are also part of the global ECD network. So there is an interest in learning a whole lot more from these kinds of resources. And then at the institutional level, there's need to build and sustain strategic partnerships among the ECD stakeholders so that there isn't, people are not working in silos. And then ensuring there is adequate human resource funding and infrastructure to enable people to take part in providing ECD services, as well as prioritizing inclusivity at the ECD centers, at the training places where the workforce is being trained in. Then at the systems level, there's need to advocate for increased government support through policy formulation and legislation, and in particular, supporting the governments at the national level and the subnational level, which are starting to now formulate holistic policies in ECD sector. And then that also goes hand in hand with national and subnational budgetary allocation for ECD workforce, as well as need to also strengthen the multi-sectoral coordination among government sectors. So this study, we will, special thanks to the partners who helped us to conduct this study in terms of funding support from UNICEF and Lego Foundation, as well as EKF USA, and the research team that made this possible, as well as all the study participants. Thank you very much, and all back to you, Professor Amina.
Thank you, Joyce. I think our next speaker will be Sadaf, who will tell us a little bit more about the need to have, a focus on locally generated knowledge as we think about translating knowledge into action. Welcome, Sadaf.
Thank you, Amina. Thanks everyone for having me here. It's really an honor to be part of this conversation. So as Amina noted, what I want to talk about today is how we translate ECD knowledge at the local level. And before I talk about that, I want to raise a more fundamental question, as noted, is when we talk about translating knowledge into practice, the question for me is which knowledge and whose knowledge? And we often distinguish between global scientific knowledge and local or indigenous knowledge. And the latter is usually considered less universal and maybe has less confirmed validity. But I want to sort of remind us that when we talk about global ECD knowledge and practices, those are still often based on global North and more specifically white, Western, European, American, middle, upper class cultures, values, norms, expectations. So many of you know, so much of our early understanding in ECD and early intervention was based on a few small controlled studies of a homogeneous group of children in the US or Canada. And yet these were not considered local knowledge. These were quickly extrapolated to be universally applicable. And yes, we wonderfully have increasing amounts of research being carried out in the global South, in Pakistan, in Kenya, in Malawi, and many more places. But often we are using these opportunities to replicate or to adapt or validate something that was initially developed in the global North or by global North researchers. And even when we start something new in the global South, we tend to start with the premises or assumptions from the global North. And the research, more often than not, is led by global North researchers. So my argument here is that the distinction we've made between global and local knowledge is not always objectively determined. And more often than not, our global knowledge base is actually biased in privileging the knowledge and values of the global North. I have a couple of examples I just want to share quickly to make this more tangible. So if we think about the major measurement tools that the ECD sector has been using across the globe over the last few decades, we see that we've tended to rely on tools developed in the West, like the ECRS, the Early Development Instrument, and so on, even if they are adapted to the local context. It's been wonderful to see in recent years, we've actually had more global efforts, such as the MELCO and the MELI, but I think we should still explore to what extent these tools and perspectives may still privilege values and norms that come from a particular context. So as an example, in assessing ECD center quality, we usually tend to look for learning centers or options for children to have choice in play. And this has been considered a universal indicator of quality. And these ideas have actually been critiqued as being reflective of individualism, of consumerism, a world where it is valuable for a child to grow up and learn to prioritize what they like, what they don't like, and to be able to make choices based on those preferences. In another society where interdependence or non-consumerism is valued, what might be other sort of important, valuable learning experiences or sort of qualities of a learning environment? Similarly, if we look at the importance that we give in ECD, in this global ECD discourse, we give a lot of importance to pretend and symbolic play. In some of the rural contexts of Pakistan where I worked, symbolic or pretend play didn't seem to play as important a role in children's home or school contexts. But children were learning through real activities rather than pretend activities. So for example, they may not have been pretending to play house or playing with stuffed animals, but they were actually helping their parents with caring for younger siblings, caring for livestock, and so on. Similarly, they may not have pretended to play shopping, but they were actually going to the market with or on behalf of their parents. So in these contexts, play, particularly pretend play, might not be the primary vehicle for learning, but the learning is still there, and it might be more salient and meaningful in real life rather than if fostered through play. However, our sort of global ECD perspective tends to value this more decontextualized pretend play with toys and materials happening in a separate classroom space isolated from the real world. And we give less value and attention to real life learning in which children are actually becoming contributing members to their families and their communities. So I think these are just some examples of some of the things we take for granted as core principles in the early childhood education discourse that I think we should question how global they are and how that relates to what we consider valid knowledge when we look at things in a more local sense. So for me, that's the first set of questions to ask is, which knowledge and whose knowledge are we calling global and local? And what are we seeking to translate? And what are the implicit assumptions underlying that knowledge and the implications when we assume this knowledge is universally applicable and acceptable? And also, what does it take for local knowledge and values and knowledge that have originated, say, from a small community in South Asia or East Africa? What does it take for that knowledge and values to be considered valid and useful to the rest of the world, as valid and useful as knowledge that has originated from the West? And I think that the ECD Hub can actually play a really transformative role in shifting this discourse and in starting to document and validate the knowledge, values, and practices that are originating from communities in Africa and in other regions of the global South. So I'll move back now to the question that we've come to in this webinar is, around how we translate knowledge into practice. And I'd love to share some of the learnings we've had at Firelight around translating ECD knowledge into action at the community level. Now, Firelight has been working with community-based organizations, CBOs, in Eastern and Southern Africa for over 2 decades. And these organizations are at the front lines in the most vulnerable communities, supporting young children and their families. And I'll be honest, we used to take a much more traditional approach to building CBOs' capacities in ECD. So we presumed that there was this global knowledge base that was untapped at the community level, and that by enabling CBOs and communities access to this knowledge, they'd be able to change the trajectories of their children's lives. To make a long story short, this didn't work. And I'll give you a few sort of examples of how it became clear to us. First, in many situations, and I'm sure many of our colleagues here can relate to this, we saw the effects of ECD interventions fade quickly, just a few years into primary school. Second, we saw that many prepackaged models, such as an approach to ECD center quality, even if they were contextualized to the local context, seemed to box people in. So if we were building CBO capacities, CBO's thinking began to become very boxed into what ECD is. So for example, ECD started being defined as a particular intervention like an ECD center in a very rigid way. And third, and maybe most fundamental, is that there was this tension and misalignment with what was being presented as global ECD knowledge and practices and what the community actually needed, wanted, and even valued. In some cases, it was very practical. For example, the ECD training was encouraging them to think about responsive stimulation, while their immediate needs were actually just basic childcare so that the moms could work and earn money because the poverty situation was so intense. In other cases, it was more fundamental. Long valued knowledge and traditions were being challenged by this so-called global ECD knowledge. So I'm summarizing here, but essentially we went through a few years of really stepping back and thinking critically and collaboratively with our CBO partners around what went wrong and how we could do better. And I'll share some of our key lessons and how we're integrating them as we continue to seek to improve our approaches to building CBO capacity in ECD. So I think the first major lesson that has come back to us is that you have to start with the communities, that CBOs and INGOs and funders and academics shouldn't assume that the issues or challenges in the community are obvious, and that there actually has to be any process of engaging around ECD has to start with meaningful participation of all stakeholders. And that includes traditional leaders, government officials, parents, early childhood educators, CBO workers, and children themselves. And this actual systems approach is actually really helpful, even if you think about the nurturing care framework, right? It recognizes that all of these stakeholders are important for a holistic approach to early childhood development. But it's also about facilitating ownership at all levels and making sure that it's not an outside-in intervention, that there is this synergy that's growing within the community, that there are capacities within the community, within the different stakeholders that all come together to improve outcomes for children. The second, which relates back to the first sort of fundamental question I raised, is that we now have realized that it's critical, absolutely critical, to recognize, to engage with, to start from Indigenous and community knowledge. So coming from the outside in with so-called global knowledge, that knowledge is not then fully integrated or owned or sustained. And it's actually quite imperialist for us to think that this knowledge is uniquely and more important than local knowledge. So this is how we now start our capacity building, is we start with what is known, and we view our CBO partners as co-creators of knowledge, as active participants in the co-creation of knowledge. So we start to understand what are the local understandings, the values given to childhood, given to raising of children, how those values are sort of reflected in the narratives, in the knowledge bases, and in the practices that communities have prioritized over the years. And this becomes so empowering when you actually spend the first half of a training actually co-creating and surfacing existing knowledge. And then when we start actually bringing in concepts from outside, they naturally become integrated with what has already been discussed and identified. It also shifts power, where it's no longer, that the CBOs are this blank slate and they just need to be given knowledge, but it's actually about we're all learning together. And then even when we do bring in new concepts, what we try to do is bring it in with a critical perspective. Just as we look at local knowledge critically, we can reflect on so-called global knowledge critically, and we can think about what and how it applies to the needs and concerns of the community. The two other lessons I would take away are maybe less surprising. The third one I would say is that to not go in with prescribed models, that we've realized that it's really important to let interventions and responses surface organically from the discussion of issues, to allow space to discuss the underlying concepts of ECD, not just sort of what do you do, but actually foster critical thinking, deep thinking with integration and application of knowledge. And the fourth one is actually quite important, and it's really important for anyone who's investing in this, is that true capacity strengthening requires time, participation, and interaction. And this requires more investment of resources, monetary resources, human resources, time resources. Can't just be a one-off workshop. There has to be ongoing engagement, especially for this collaborative knowledge building that helps really translate things into practice. I'll stop there because I know that we have wonderful things to hear from other colleagues.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sadaf. There are very many comments on the section, so please have a look and respond. And I think it's really well received. We need to critically look at the knowledge we want to translate, and very much appreciate your tips on issues, how to look at it, how do we actually try to align different kinds of knowledge. Thank you. Our next speaker will be Professor Mark, and he'll speak about models of training, so how do we best ensure as we go out to capacity build, it has lasting effect and impact. Welcome, Prof.
Thanks, Amina, and thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to approach this from a slightly different angle, and one of the things I want to talk about is training. But I suppose what I mostly want to talk about is how does the hub do things somewhat differently. I think we've heard from Sadaf about one very important core component of that, I think, and it's obviously working with communities and working from the community up. But I want to also argue that I think we've been missing, with the focus on content, with the focus on information, with the focus on the components of interventions, that what we've done is, and I fully take on board what Sadaf was saying about not assuming that global knowledge is relevant or the best. But I would suggest that almost all the knowledge that we do have, as was pointed out earlier, is the minute that even when studies have shown to be effective in tightly controlled ways, two things happen: is over time the impacts disappear, and that's very, very common. In fact, it's quite rare for those impacts, and of course there may be very many reasons for that. But equally, when attempts are made to scale those, they don't work in the same way. And so what we do is when they don't scale, then what we think we need to do is then develop a new one. So just as at a quick thing, we have, you know, if you think globally, we have Sure Start, Head Start, Good Start, Smart Start. And so whenever something doesn't scale or we think it doesn't work, we create a new intervention. And I sort of want to take a step back from that and actually say, I don't actually think right now that's the way we need to go. We need to go back to what the basics are. Following on Sadaf, I think one of the things we need to do is we need to, whatever gets done has to be done in partnership with communities. Without that, we may as well just not do anything. It has to start there. We've spent so much time focusing on the what of the intervention that I think what we've also forgotten is we've forgotten the who of interventions. So who are the people who are recruited and then trained as whatever the language is, community health worker, ECD practitioner, ECD counselor, whatever it might be, nurturing care, therapist, whatever the term we use. How do we select people for that? What are the skills that we deem to be important? And so often what we do in our training is we select people often quite randomly. We had a case recently in South Africa, in a rural part of South Africa, where a Ministry of Health person looked in wonder at the local NGO that was delivering the intervention and said, "So I've never experienced that. You actually interview and then select potential community health workers." That was not their experience of how it worked, is they were presented with lists of people that they then had to train. So the idea of how you recruit people and what skills those people have. And often what we do is we think that they have to have a particular knowledge, for example. Now, of course, a knowledge of an indigenous practice might be incredibly useful. But in my mind, what we're missing is that, in fact, the capacity for anybody involved in any kind of work with this ECD, if you're able to form a connection and a relationship with another, that's utterly vital. Without that, you can have all the information you want, whether that's information of a global practice or a local practice. But if all you're doing is simply transmitting knowledge or information in a kind of a in a one-way direction, as opposed to using the mechanism of the relationship, I think there's often problems. And so what happens then in the interventions or training like that is people just, community health workers or whoever it might be, just present information in a lecture. And again, we know that doesn't change behavior. We know that behavior changes with practice. It changes in the context of a relationship. So the capacity to actually listen to somebody and ask open-ended questions and form a connection with them. I would, and I'm the old white male in this panel, so I'm really happy to be shot down on this. But I do think that the capacity to form a connection and a relationship with another and listen to them is a global thing. I do think everyone does that, and it's the basis of any change. And we often don't choose the people that we train based on that. We don't train them on their capacity to actually form an empathic, caring relationship, and can they ask open-ended questions, and can they sit with difficult things when they don't have a solution. I'm not sure we do that. So I suppose in the training, I'm asking to kind of, in a way, take a step back, go back to the real basics of how we would want somebody to engage with us. Because in so many cases, again, I would suggest that people are incredibly resourceful, resilient, in no matter what the context is. And so what they often really want is, because the adversity is so extreme, they want somebody to be with them for a while and to hear their story. And that's the start of it. It's not all of it, because then, of course, if it's whatever the indigenous practice is, it's also about trying to find ways to facilitate that. If a caregiver is struggling to spend time with her child, are there ways through the relationship to increase that time? And those, I think, are the things we should be training for. Not often what happens, and I've seen some trainings where you've got the first 7 pages of the training manual, which are all about the kind of Erickson's theory of child development, any other bunch of theories of child development, and even if I were to disagree with what Sadaf was saying, and I don't, But even if that was the indigenous knowledge, simply learning page after page of the information, I'm not sure is how we should be training. And that has been our training model. It's been a kind of a train and run. And we've all been guilty of that. I've been guilty of that. International NGOs are often very guilty of that. Florence, maybe UNICEF sometimes is a bit guilty of that. I'm very guilty of it, I know that. But I think we have to try to do training differently, because also if, for example, the capacity to be empathic, the capacity to ask an open-ended question, the capacity to have enough knowledge to know where to refer the person, the family, the caregiver, and the child, is when somebody's got that, they're actually really, really good if they're doing work on HIV. They're really good and they're doing work on ECD, because at the end of the day in ECD, one of the key components, I think, again, I'm prepared to be shot down here, and I do think this is universal, is the capacity to build that relationship with your infant, with your young child, to be able to be with them in their struggles, to support them, to create this environment, is what we want caregivers to do. The details of that are going to vary massively, and it's important that they are based on local culture. But that overall aim, the goal of what we're trying to do, I do think is fairly universal. And if we can mirror that in the relationship and how we train between the community health worker and the caregiver in the intervention, then we'll be doing something quite powerful in terms of modeling what we want the caregiver to essentially do with the child, and openness, following the child's lead. If the child wants to go and help in the market, well, brilliant, like bring them along, maybe talk to them while that's happening, and tell a few jokes if that's what you want, and have laugh. If the child wants to stop and play with something, well, then follow their lead. And it's that I think we should be training for. And if we do train like that, is people will be quite able to then become a community health worker working in malaria and HIV and TB and lots of other places, because it's because the foundation is a human relationship. If they can help caregivers problem solve, again, I think that would be useful, not to come in with the answer. And I think that's been one of the biggest, maybe it's maybe a bit extreme to say it, but probably one of the big crimes of all kinds of imported knowledge from the top down, is that it's seen as the answer, as opposed to there may be many answers to this problem. There may be many solutions. And are we not trying to facilitate the situation to allow caregivers to find the right thing that works for them? And bearing in mind that it might not even be the same for different caregivers within the same community. And those are the things that I believe we should be training for. And of course, some content, some information is key, but I think we've gone way too much on information and content, as opposed to the building blocks of what makes a relationship and what to do. So I'm going to stop there. And yeah, hopefully we can have some time for discussion later. Thanks, Amina.
Thank you. I find this a very exciting discussion. Sadaf spoke in details about the content. Mark has been able to bring us about, like the how, what are we focusing on, beyond the content. I would like to invite our colleague Zarina, who would share the experiences about capacity building in preschools in the Asian region. Zarina, welcome.
Thank you very much for giving me opportunity to share. I would like to share my screen then with you.
Yes, you can.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
We can, thanks.
I'm very sorry, I cannot turn on my camera because of the internet connection. So that's why I just will try and hope the presentation will be clear and you can see it. First of all, I would like, again, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to share the Aga Khan Foundation, Tajikistan, the experience which we had in the development of early childhood development program. And mainly the Aga Khan Foundation during our work for about 50 years alongside with other agencies of the Aga Khan Development Network. We have been working for mostly with the poorest and most marginalized communities in several areas, and the several directions which we have within the Aga Khan Foundation. It is the agriculture and food security, civil society, climate resilience, early childhood development, education, health and nutrition, and work and enterprise. So the principles which the Aga Khan Foundation is based on the gender equality, diversity, and inclusion, which are prioritized in all our programs. And maybe like the strength part of this is that we have been working in integrated approach and multi-sectoral approaches. The main guiding framework for our Aga Khan Foundation program is we have been based in mainly the early childhood development program is based on the academic quality of life framework, Aga Khan Foundation global framework, and for sure the nurturing care framework of WHO and UNICEF. The goal of our program is to ensure that every girls and boys from the birth to 6 years old have a good start in their lives, and influencing the context and environments in which they are growing through the enhanced family and community support program, through the improved access to quality health and pre-primary and child care services, and strengthening the human resources and institutions. Aga Khan Foundation approaches is based on the 5 main directions. Is that if we are talking about the early childhood development program, and since 2009 we have been started this. So the first approach was like to identify the problem, to know what is the challenges within the context is, and how can the have comparative advantage to respond to these challenges. Then design and adapt the solutions, the best ECD solutions, which we have been thinking that would be support to change the situation for the better. The third step is the partnership, the cooperation of the Aga Khan Foundation, our academic network, together with civil society, with the communities, with the government in development of the models which would be the most cost-effective and for sure the evidence-based ECD models which are leveraged both in public and private funds and influence to the policy in practice. And the 5th step was like the scaling up of our evidence-based ECD solutions. In 2009, when the Aga Khan Foundation raised this issue, the importance was that just 9% of the children was covered by pre-primary education. And this was like the most vulnerable group which do not have access to the pre-primary education. And we have been starting to develop the community-based, based on the mainstream schools, early childhood development centers, which up to date just increased and scaled for the 60% of the children, like increase the 60% of coverage of children of pre-primary age from 3 years to 6-fold in Gabao, the coverage of the preschool education. And after that, during while we have been implemented our model, we had a lot of cooperation and with our partners organizations such as the UNICEF, Open Society Institutes, and together with the government representatives. In this case, I'm talking about the Ministry of Education and Sciences, which have been adopted the curriculum and accepted the curriculum based on the model which we have been implementing in Gabao, based on our mainstream schools. Also the government, by the support of the government, we has been scaled this model to the additional 400 centers through the global partner educations such as the UNICEF and Open Society Institutes. And up to date, I would like to say that even within the country, we have like 16% coverage for now of children to the pre-primary education, and up to date the number of these ECD centers increased to 1,770 centers. So the main issues and the main activities in the our community ECDs was like that it showed the strong evidence-based model. So the results which we have been implemented and research we have been the assessment of the, have been conducted, and the outcomes and impacts which our ECD centers gave to the children, how they are for their learning, for their skill development. It's become this huge, strong evidence-based practice and model, which helped us then that the government was adopted this model. And currently within the country, with the partnership of our organization, we are trying to scaling up this model within the Tajikistan. Currently, our program based on like the nature and care framework, and as we understand that, we know that the ECD is starting from the pregnancy, and it is very important to have the strong parents program from the beginning. And together with the Ministry of Health and Social Protection, we are trying to work together to cooperate the health system with education in raising the importance of the ECD from early age. And when we are talking that about the education of children, it doesn't mean that just it should be in the pre-primary level. And we, by the support of the Ministry of Health and Social Protection, currently Aga Khan Foundation, in cooperation with the UNICEF, we are under the working group on development, the normative documents related to the early childhood development, starting from the 0 to 3, and based on with the Ministry of Education, the 3 to 6 years old. Here also we are continuing the capacity building of health and education specialists. And here I just wanted to share with you that mainly for now we have like the good cooperation with the within the level of the Ministry of Health and Social Protection, and through them we have been starting to conducting the joint trainings on the holistic approach to early childhood development. And in this picture you can see the specialists which we have like the integrated approach, where the health workers together with ECD specialists are going through the learning process, and then we are trying to we are trying to implement like the comprehensive program within the community, which will covers, and this service will be provided and within the health care, primary healthcare settings, and also within the early childhood development centers, which we have under the mainstream school. As we are currently also working with the Ministry of Education and Social Protection on the discussion that the program which we had earlier and the standards which we in 2011 was approved by the government have need to be updated based on the nurture care framework and based on the comprehensive approaches. So this is like the brief information on the activities we are doing within the Aga Khan Foundation together with other our educational partners. And if there would be any question, I would be glad to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zarina, for that description of an ongoing program. And now I will hand over to Joyce, who will facilitate the question and answer session. I do have a few questions for the panelists, but for the sake of time, I would first let the audience, ask questions, and then we'll see if we can go to the prepared ones. Thank you, Joyce.
Okay, thank you, Amina. I see that Sweta's hand is up. Sweta, would you like to go with your question live? Hello, Sweta.
Hi, Joyce. Sorry, I think that was an error.
Okay, so if you have any questions, please put them on the Q&A box as we talk, as we go ahead, and then they will be answered by the panelists. But there was a question on the training opportunities at the hub and whether they are open to journalists covering ECD related stories, and how can journalists partner with the hub to do that. Amina, would you like to take that question?
Yes, thank you very much. I think for us, being able to package the information and communicate it adequately to the larger population is key to our mission and goals. So yes, there will be opportunities for discussions with journalists and for them to be included in some of our trainings so that we can really communicate to the larger population about this. And therefore, our colleague from the media should keep an eye to upcoming opportunities. And they should also feel free to propose to us the gaps they see and what would be, profit, of advantage to them to participate in. Thank you.
Samuel Ponsa, I hope I said that correctly. You can ask your question live.
All right, thanks very much, Joyce. This is Samuel Mponza from Ghana. I wanted to know if ECD is implemented in Ghana. And if it's not implemented in Ghana, what are the way forward? So that we can also tap into to improve the system. Thank you.
Does any panelist want to answer that?
I can come in as part of just UNICEF and also personally what I know about ECD. Samuel, you said you're from Ghana and you're asking whether there is ECD in Ghana, if I heard you right.
Yes, please, Prof.
Okay, because what I know in one of the recent webinars, Director of Ministry of Education in Ghana had a very good webinar on the floor, teaching us, sharing knowledge of how they've started universal one-year preschool in Ghana. And I think it must be now in its third year. So it's very good to find out from them what's happening, because part of what he said was it was a great move by the government and that they were still battling with the community. The community was still trying to understand what they mean by this preschool, pre-primary year, taking their children 1 year earlier. And he was commending us that the recommendation was to highly sensitize the community before such a government program is rolled out. So with that evidence, I do believe that there is pre-ECD, especially for the ECE in Ghana.
Okay, great to hear that.
My colleagues can add on. Over.
So I see someone on the chat, Sheila Manji, has put a contact for the Ghana ECD network, which you can contact for more information.
Very well.
Okay, thank you for that. Florence, could you also take this other question? There is a question on UNICEF and whether UNICEF agrees with Dr. Shalwani that local interventions should begin by recruiting meaningful participation by stakeholders, including indigenous culture bearers in the local community.
Thank you. I really would want to say that we as UNICEF, we agree with the fact that indigenous communities are key stakeholders in what we do with our early childhood development. When you talk of nurturing care framework, nurturing care interventions, you know that one of our pillars is dealing with families and communities in how they implement nurturing care. So we really, as we train, part of the adaptation is to first ensure that we have the knowledge of the indigenous people, the local context of the country office, and country office may be covering different actually ethnic groups which understand nurturing care in their different portfolios. Slightly different, but at the end of the day is stimulating the child and providing early learning opportunities and intentionally stimulating their brain. So to us, really, it shouldn't be that we are imparting some outside approaches over the indigenous, but it's more of, as Professor explained it, it's the approach, but the content has to be really indigenized for me to understand what the local team is understanding as ECD. However, having said that, there is also a window of teaching them. For example, they may know that, yes, I do this, but they have never known that what they do is really key in stimulating this child. So if I teach the mother that playing this fiber ball with my baby, they've known it as a norm, but when you really teach them to intentionally do it, they themselves can see an improvement. So I hope I've answered, but it's like we don't defer, but we include it in our training as one of the key stakeholders. Over.
Thank you, Florence. There is a question from Susan Graham. How can we build coaching into existing models at every level? It is expensive to implement, but with powerful results that empower attitudinal, knowledge-based, and behavioral changes. Training is not enough. If we are all about relationships, how can we make relationship-based coaching happen? Any panelists can take that.
I would propose, Mark.
I can take a stab at it. I mean, you know, for me, the words we use, I think very often in context of, you know, someone once said to me, my mentor, one of my mentors years ago said to me that, and again, I'm from my very privileged perspective, being poor is incredibly expensive because you often live furthest away from where you can get access to cheap food. Your transport to work is more because of the way in which cities are often constructed and all the things that go with that. And so very often is the capacity of a caregiver to be more present, to spend more time with their infant, with their child, is not a choice. It's because there are multitude of barriers that are being put up in their lives all the time by the material conditions of their existence, the relationship they might be in. And so whether a relationship with a ECD counselor, as I said, whatever you want to call it, if that helps in finding different unthought of problem solving techniques to get to help solve some of those barriers and those solutions, if you want to call that coaching, I think that would be a good thing. Coaching, I'm not sure would be that the term would be understood by many communities. I don't know. You know, I have an idea of what it is, but again, from a particular perspective, sitting here in Cape Town. So again, I think a good coach for me starts with a relationship. You know, is available to be trusted, is available to problem solve, is available to goal set with somebody, with, you know, to think of alternative ways of seeking help or seeking, you know, we know that one of the key things in whatever, you know, wherever you are is if you feel support within your family, within your relationship, and within your community, if you feel connected to and feel supported by people, people do better, much better. And the more disconnected, the more unsupported they feel, the less well they do and the less well their children do. So I would suggest that anything, whatever we want to call it, if that's the basis of connecting people to one another, of connecting them to support systems that they may not have even realized were there. Facilitating, children are incredibly demanding. And if you've got very little time, it's an incredibly demanding task. While if you, even within all those constraints, if you can find a slightly different way of engaging with your child, very often it's incredibly mutually beneficial to both. And it lightens a load, even with a little bit of time. But very often, because of these barriers that have been put in people's lives, I don't mean put by somebody else, but just where people are in their lives, it's difficult to see that. And if somebody's helping them by coaching, by kind of playing, by whatever it might be, I can't see that being a bad thing. But whether you call it coaching, I don't know. For me, again, I'm being very repetitive here. I think it's ultimately about the relationships, beginning, middle, and end. Yeah, thanks, Amina.
Okay, we do have another question from Robert Sokol. Robert, would you like to ask the question?
Oh,
And unmute yourself.
am I audible?
Yes.
So what I was asking for a bit of position taking from UNICEF on is that we've had two contributions, one by Dr. Shalwani and one by Professor Tomlinson, that although very gently and politely, they basically say that a lot of the framework in which the official discourse of early childhood intervention is phrased misses an essential point. So Dr. Shalwani's point was that it's not clear that all of the stakeholders get to participate meaningfully. Some are typically construed as recipients of wisdom and others as transmitters of established knowledge. And I think she did a great job of questioning the validity of that separation. And then Professor Tomlinson, I think quite correctly said that very often when you look at the criteria used for recruiting local participants by an agency which is coming into a community to initiate an ECE program, the criteria tend to be to do with knowledge. He mentioned indigenous knowledge, but I think very often they're more to do with credentials, like how many years of schooling does the person have? Do they understand the language of the intervening agency? And that very little is done to actually choose amongst the possible local participants, the ones who show the so-called soft skills of being able to communicate effectively with people and to listen effectively. So basically I'm asking, I haven't seen those two very valuable ideas represented in the guidelines being published by WHO and UNICEF for implementing the nurture and care framework. Have I missed them? Are they there and I'm just not seeing them?
I can try. Thanks, Robert. I mean, I'm being one of the people that's part of putting together the Nurturing Care Handbook. I would have to take some responsibility if that's not there. I like to think that what the handbook, what the framework tries to do is to be able to speak to essentially every country in the world, and so what it tries to do is to create enough of an open framework with enough of the guiding principles to speak to what you're suggesting. If in your reading they're not there, I'd be very happy to engage with you to see to what extent we can do that more, and I'm sure other people involved would do that. But I think the idea of, for example, working first and foremost, taking the lead from communities themselves is an important one. I think the idea of where possible, and doing as much as you can possibly do in that regard to make sure that the people that are being hired, recruited, are from within those communities themselves. In our studies in South Africa, we would call, this is a terrible phrase, some people don't like it, we call them sort of positive peer deviance, and that sounds a terrible thing. It sounds like something criminal almost, but it's, in our case, it's often women who live within those communities, who have the same struggles, living often with the same levels of poverty, and yet have managed to find ways to better connect themselves to other, and themselves often bring up thriving children despite all the struggles. So those are the criteria. And so I would like to imagine that some of that is conveyed. But as I said, if it's not, I really am absolutely happy to engage with you. And then I wanted to say one other thing, and this might be very controversial. So I'll say it anyway, because we got 15 minutes left, and then I can just run away. But there is a level that of critical look at all knowledges that is important. You know, global North knowledges that are put here is of course problematic, but there are lots of local knowledges that also should also be questioned. You know, I don't think it's I fight terribly. I do not think it's good to hit children. I don't think that's a good practice. It's not. I think corporal punishment is damaging to children. There are other ways of doing it. But go around the world and it's fairly ubiquitous. And many communities would say that's part of what we do. The thing that I struggle with is, am I in a position to push against that? Who am I to say how somebody in Vietnam should or shouldn't hit their children? Am I in a position to? So I still think I'm right, but I don't know. But we should also have a very critical eye, not only at what's coming from the global North. In some ways, that's actually quite easy because so much of it can be quite dodgy. But equally, there may be practices that we just do need to also cast a critical eye on locally as well. It's just, yeah. But maybe that's not that controversial. I don't know. Thank you.
Florence has her hand up.
Yeah.
Don't you remark on that? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. And Prof. Mark, and to add on for those critically observed questions. The two gaps, one, whether all stakeholders are to participate or in the initiative, or some kind of rather look like just recipients, and also a comment on the recruiting criteria. I'll start by agreeing with the Prof. Mark that the nurturing care framework, when we go through it, it intended to address these gaps. But as you said, if it's not coming out across, then there is need even more work to explain it. But I would want to say that on top of the nurturing care framework, there is a nurturing care guide that will soon be coming out to kind of bring this further to the national level and practitioners. However, within the nurturing care guide, framework itself, I'll still go back to our 5 strategic actions. And actually the second strategic action was focusing on families and their communities. And when you read the proposed action at country level, quote from the copy I have here, it includes the fact that we have to draw on families' positive voices, beliefs, practices, and needs, and incorporate them in local and national plans. Now, being a global framework, I think this is a loaded statement. And if it's unpacked at national and subnational level, I trust that it can incorporate what Dr. Shadaf was talking about. However, at implementation level, we may have a lot still to be desired, but that statement is loaded. And when you read the 5 actions that even follow that, supporting communities in identifying the local champions, to plan communication strategies, there's this particular one, to strengthen and support community platforms, which include faith groups, traditional leaders, community health workers, women groups, parent organizations. We really still, then the framework still puts the parent, the caregiver, at the center of all this. However, how we do it, where and when, I think it's still the implementation that has to go on. Countries have tried, but we're still in the our infant stages as early childhood development, but I believe it will get there. And it connects to what someone, our colleague has already commented, that if it comes as if it's outside and foreign, when the vibe disappears, it's not sustainable. However, if it is rooted in our beliefs and practices at community level, it will be sustained, whether initiatives come and go. Then related to the recruitment, I think the recruitment criteria is also closely attached to the fact that nurturing care, or ECD, did not come in as a parallel program, but the intention is to integrate it in the existing interventions to improve the quality. So that's why I may choose the daycare workers, the nurses, the teachers, the social workers, as people already existing doing their work with children. However, now I have to strengthen their soft skills to make sure that they support responsive caregiving and teach our caregivers on how to nurture their babies. So maybe that's how then it falls short of saying, I may be a nurse who may not be a very good communicator. So by the time you bring me out to be the real frontliner you want, plus my time management, plus my being overwhelmed with work, I may be not teaching the mothers as I'm supposed to. But by the nature of nurturing care and ECD, for ECD, we use the existing platforms because that's where we meet mothers and caregivers most. Over. Thank you.
So I'd like to remind all participants that the recording of the webinar will be put on the website and on YouTube. So please check out. And I think a link will be shared with you in your emails. So please look out for that, for those who are asking. Back to the hub, maybe Amina, you could take this. There's a question from Margaret and she asks, practically, how will the content on the hub be accessible by the local communities like ECD teachers, community health workers, and parents?
Thank you, Margaret. At the start of our activities, one of the things we are planning to do is actually to partner with county governments, these are regional governments, and work on the ground. So any kind of capacity building and training, mentoring for caregivers and other frontline workers in the field would actually happen through face-to-face programs that would arrange in the field. So the online workshops and other trainings would be for the professionals. So that's how we would approach it. Thank you, Joyce.
All right. I think that's, so there are many questions, but I don't think we will have sufficient time to get to them all. We only have a few minutes left. So at this point, I will hand it over to, I don't think she's online. But so thank you all for the questions. We are planning to continue the discussions to be able to respond to all of the questions that you have concerning the hub and also concerning other capacity building activities. And with that, we would like to.
Yes, can I have a minute?
Maybe we could take. Okay, let's go ahead.
Sorry, just before the panelists go, for me, I think the key question to them, how would you measure success for this hub? You know, what challenge are you throwing out there for IHD to pick? And participants also, please feel free to write your comments there in the chat. We will take note of this and it will guide our planning and our next steps. Yeah, so panelists, please. Sadaf, you can start.
Sure. I think I would reiterate what I had said earlier, that for me, success would look like the hub being a space, an active and vibrant space where knowledge, values, practices from around the globe relating to the care and upbringing of children and care for their families and empowerment for their families, where all of that knowledge and those practices can be documented, can be tested, can be validated, can be integrated and built on. And I think especially sort of giving greater attention to knowledge coming from Africa and other regions in the global South. So that would be one thing. I think the other thing is for it to be a go-to, the place where people go to find this knowledge and best practices from around the world, a space where researchers and practitioners can come together with respect, with collaboration, where we can learn from one another and together build a more comprehensive knowledge and practice base. Thanks.
Thank you, Sadaf. Zarina, what would success look to you for this hub?
Thank you. I think, yes, the habit would be like the good opportunity and the space to learn something new, to share your experience which you have, because every development, every something new you have just to learn what is happening around. And even our models, which we are currently implementing and going through within our country, all of this before, when you are trying to do something new, you have to learn what is happening around. What was the experience? Maybe something went good, or there were some difficulties and problems, and it to have the space where you can share your ideas, where you can learn from the experience which have been successful or not. It can also help you just to be to do not, for example, spend more time, because there is some experience and there is some successes and challenges who other countries faced. And this is where would be very helpful. And I think that to have such kind of hub also would be very good if even, for example, in our country, we have a very active national networks organization, the parents organization, who are just become very strong advocate of the early childhood development program, early childhood intervention program for children with developmental delays and disabilities. And they are also influencing in making the policy more friendly towards the children within our community. So I think that this hub might help to work more cooperatively, to learn more and to give to share more what we have in Tajikistan about our countries also. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, any comments from you?
Thanks, Amina. I suppose two things in there, they're interlinked. The one is that I think at the timing of the hub and the launch of the hub is an opportune time, with the kind of where we're moving to in the next 20 years, whether that's as a consequence of the pandemic, but also the consequence of climate breakdown and what the world's going to be going through. And we know that children, and particularly poor children, are going to take the brunt of that, and they already are. So there's something about the timing. And then the challenge to me would be to use to the hub is to do something different. We're very, very good at rehashing things. There was a circular early in the year that had of a paper that had come out that showed that if you were a pregnant woman in a rural area, that the further you were away from the rural health clinic, the more likely you were to die in childbirth. And it was publicized as quite a, as a finding. And I kind of got quite despairing at the time. And I thought, but like, we knew that in 1940 in China with the barefoot doctors. We knew it in 1978 at Alma Ata. We knew it in 1990. And so we kind of keep, in a way, as somebody, and I can't remember who it was, is we're very good at admiring the problem. So we know there's a problem, we describe it and we describe it endlessly, but you have an opportunity to do it differently and throw out a lot of the old and make it innovative, because that's what we're going to need in the next 20 years, not rehashing the old things. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Florence? 1 minute, apologies, we're just at the end of our time. You're muted, Florence.
Thanks very much. And in addition to my colleagues, how do I see the success of such a hub? I just want to say that if it could be a hub where most of our colleagues in search of the how to implement ECD in our different countries, if we can find more of the how content and how beyond pilot, but to scale. How has Rwanda scaled up and they produce ABC and it's in the hub? And if Zambia, how has it interacted and how far, how and who, I think I would be happy to see that in the lab, in the hub. And also, which leads to knowledge sharing across the countries. Data, therefore, of what we have done and progress in the countries, in the region. Something that, as my earlier colleague asked, that how then do NGOs access, how do they get this nice information? If they can get the how, I believe then would have moved a step further as a success of this hub. Over.
Thank you very much. So I think these are really exciting ideas. I see so many points and reflections in the chat. We'll take this into consideration and work towards meeting the expectations. We invite everyone to join us in the virtual launch of the hub on Monday. We will send the link around, and we look forward to having an engaging and interactive process as we develop the hub. Thank you. Over to you, Joyce. Do we still have Joyce? I think we may have lost her, but I think it's been a really, really engaging discussion.
Yes.
We know. Oh,
sorry. I think I dropped a little bit, but okay, thank you very much, Amina. We didn't get to all the questions today, but we'll be organizing a technical help chat soon where these questions will be addressed in more detail by panelists. So please keep an eye out for that. Thank you to our excellent panelists for making the time to share your expertise in this webinar. Thank you very much. And on behalf of the organizers, thank you all for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you for the great insights. Bye-bye.
Bye, Florence. Bye.
Thank you very much for organization. It's wonderful webinar. Take care.
Thank you too.